Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at how to create a web API service in C#. So to get us started, we're going to be creating a web API service of quotes, right? So we're going to be creating a quotes service. It's a simple example really. So let's get started. So we're going to start by making a directory to work on, following quotes. I'm going to call this directory following quotes, and then I'm going to cd into that directory. Alright, so so now that I've made the directory to work on, I'm going to start by creating a web API template. This is C#, so that's simple stuff. So we're going to say .NET new web API -f net 6.0. right, so I'm on .NET 6, so that's why I say net 6.0. so for you it might be different if you're using a different version of .NET, but this is for me. Okay, so now we can press enter. So as you can see, a template ASP.NET Core Web API was created successfully. So now that we have a web API template to get us started, let us see this template. Okay, so we're gonna go to Visual Studio Code inside this directory. Alright, so now that we are in Visual Studio Code, we see that we already have some files here, right? Okay, so this is a basic template to get us started with our web API service, right? So we don't need any of this. I'm not even going to go through this code. We just don't need this. We're going to delete this weather focused model class. Just delete this, and then delete this controllers folder as well. You're going to create our own controllers. Alright, nice. So now your code should be like this. So to get us started, we're going to create a models folder. So I'm going to say new folder models. Right, so inside models we're going to create a script, call it quote.cs. right, so this will be a class to represent a blueprint for a quote, what a quote typically is like. So let's get started. We're going to say namespace, always create a namespace, right? Namespace, and I'm going to take the main folder following quotes dash this current folder that we on, models. That's how you create your namespace, models. Awesome. Okay, so now let's create the class, public class quote. So a quote will typically have an ID. We need an ID in order to distinguish one quote from another, right? So each and every quote must be unique, so we must have an ID. This is the quote ID, and we're going to create a getter and setter for that. Right, the quote must have an author. Who wrote the code, right? Public string author. Getter and setter for that as well. Lastly, the quote itself, right? So you're going to say public string quote. I'm going to create a getter and setter for this as well. Alright, so this is the model class. This is, sorry, I must remove that. Okay, so this is a model class of what a quote looks like. So it's a model of a quote. A quote will have an ID to make it unique. A quote will have an author who wrote the quote. A quote will contain the quote itself. Okay, so now that we have this model class, let's get started creating the service quote, right? So we're going to create our service class. So we're going to first say new folder services, right? So inside the services folder we're going to create a new C# script. We're going to call it the quote service. That's yes. Nice. Okay, so now that we've created our quote service, by the way, the quote service is like the engine of the web API. It's like the engine class of the web API itself. Like this is where the logic goes. Okay, so we first need to import our model class since we'll be using it. So you're going to say using models, right? So this will give us access to whatever class is in the models folder. Okay, and then we're going to say namespace, or let's create a namespace, right? Namespace main directory and this current directory, which is services. Nice. All right, so let's get started creating quotes class. So we're going to say public class quote service. Nice. So now that we've created our quote service class, we need an ID, right? We need an ID to track each and every quote that is added to our service, right? So whenever we're adding a quote to the service, we want to make sure that it has a unique ID, right? So we're gonna create an instance of an ID. So static int ID, gonna call it available ID. Available ID. We're gonna initially set it to 0, right? So this will assign an ID to each and every quote that is added. So each and every quote added will be given available ID. Nice. Okay, so we also need a database. Now since this is just an exercise, right, a learning exercise, we won't go as far as using any persistent storage. We're just going to use a list to store our quotes, right? A list database. We're going to use a basic list. So we're going to say temporary database. We're going to create a temporary database or cache, if you will, because it only persists as long as the program is running. After you exit the program and then start the program again, the data will reset, right? So that means that it's not permanent storage, it's temporary database, because we're just using a list. So you're just going to say public list of quote, and then you're going to call it quotes database. All right, now that we have our temporary database and we have an available ID to assign every quote that is added, we now need to create a static instance. All right, a static instance for our quote service. Right, so this is a static instance. What does this mean though? This means that we no longer want any other class to be able to create an instance of the quote service. So once we call this static, okay, let me just put this here, parentheses here. Okay, so now we're saying that this class is no longer instantiable because we called this static quote service constructor. So this is a static quote service constructor. Whenever you're creating a static constructor, you're now saying that this class must not be instantiated anymore. Okay, so another fancy word for it is what do these developers say it is? Oh, a singleton. You can call this one a singleton. This is a singleton. We're basically creating a singleton for this class. Okay, nice. Now inside this constructor here, let's populate the database that we created here, the temporal database, with a few quotes, right? Initial data. Let's populate it with initial data. So populate the database with starting data, some small data. Okay, so we're gonna say quotes database quotes database equals to Okay, I'm not sure why that is. Okay, we're supposed to say the list is static, not public but static. Sorry, this list here is supposed to be static. Okay, so quotes database equals to new list of quotes, and then we say new quote. So remember that a quote will have an ID, so we're just going to say this is 0, and then the quote will also have an author, so we're going to say this is Fallen World Studios, and then the quote itself. So let's just move this to another line, and this to another line as well, so that we can visually see it. Okay, so the ID is 0, the author is Fallen World Studios, and the quote itself is don't say we didn't do anything for you. Nice. Okay, so we have the first entry. Okay, let's just put a semicolons here. Okay, so we have the first entry in our database, which is the first quote here. The quote has an ID of 0, and the author is Fallen World Studios, and the quote itself is don't say we didn't do anything for you. Okay, nice. So let's add another quote, right? So since this is a list, we can just move this here. So we can just copy paste this. Okay, and then we say the ID now is 1. Alright, so let's change this now to say maybe unknown. The quote, the world is a vampire. Alright, nice. So we have 2 quotes in our database. So our database is initially populated with 2 quotes, right? So now we can't say now that the available ID is 0, because the ID here 0 is taken for this first quote, and the ID 1 is taken. So the next quote to be added into the database must have an ID of 2 now. So we're saying that the next available ID will be 2. So whenever we add a quote, we'll assign it to this new available ID. Nice. Okay, so what have we done here so far? We've created a class quote savers, and then we created an ID to track each and every quote that is added, and then we created a temporary database, or a cache, like it's sort of like a fake database, so in the form of a list. And then we created a singleton for the quote savers, and inside the singleton we decided to initialize or populate the database with a few data entries. So we added first quote, and we added a second quote. Alright, now we're going to get started getting all the codes. We're going to write a method to get all the codes right in a database. So we're going to write a method that gets all the codes in the database. So let's get started. We're going to say public static, it returns a list of quotes and the method is called get all. So it gets all the codes, so therefore it will return quote database okay, yeah. So this method right here gets all the quotes. Right. Okay, so now that we have written a quote savers, let's now write a controller that will connect this savers to our client. So we're going to create a new folder, call this folder controllers. Right. So inside this controllers, we're going to create a quotes controller class. Okay, right. So remember, we're going to be using the models class. We're also going to be using the services class that we created, and also we're going to be using Microsoft.asp.NET Core, and we need controllers. It's MVC, sorry, it's MVC. Yes, model view controller. Alright, so the first thing remember to do is create the namespace quotes dot controllers. Nice. Okay, and now we can create a class for the quotes controller. Right, and this quotes controller class, sorry, I'm supposed to say here this is class, yes, public class quotes controller, and it must extend controller base. Right, so we have to have a few annotations here. Since we're working with APIs, we're gonna have an API controller annotation and a route annotation, and put here this as controller. This is a controller class. Alright, what is this? Indicates the type all derived types are used to serve HTTP response controllers. Decorative with repeater configured features and behavior circuits that are improving the developer. The namespace already contains the definition for, okay, so this is just a bug because there's no other class that is called quotes controller. So I'm just gonna restart my Visual Studio Code because it seems that I'm having an unusual bug. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to Visual Studio Code again. Alright, nice. Now that the bug is gone, okay, let me just remove this curly brace here. It's supposed to be a square bracket. Nice. Okay, so what have we done here? We imported a few modules. The first two, you know, the models and the services, because we created them ourselves, and then we also imported some ASP.NET Core.MVC because we are working with model view controllers. Alright, so now what we're gonna do here, right, in this controller class is, first note that we're calling this class quotes controller, right? So this, because here we have this annotation API controller and route controller, automatically a route has been created for us. This quotes will form part of our path, right? Will form part of our URL. This will form part of our URL. So if you have a URL of http:/localhost and then some port, maybe the port is 1111, then you'll have dash, and then for our URL part we'll have quotes. Right? So this quotes right here comes from this naming of this class right here. So we named this class quotes controller. That's why here we'll have quotes. So this controller will automatically be removed and will have quotes, right? But you'll see that soon enough. Okay, so firstly what we want is to create an action, or rather an HTTP action to get all the quotes from our service and into the client. From our service, so we create an HTTP action to get all quotes from our service to the client, right? So whoever is calling all the quotes, right? So the client, it will be the browser, right? The web browser. So we're going to create an HTTP action to get all the quotes from our service, the service that we created here. So we're going to basically be calling this method right here to return all the quotes, right? Using this quote controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to say HTTP get annotation, and we're going to say public action results and then we pass in a list of quote, and then we say get and this result returns quote service, right? Quote service, the quote service singleton that we created dot get all, and that's it. So I know that we've done a lot, but really it's simple. The first thing we did was create a quote class, right? A quote template. This represents what a quote typically looks like, and then we created a quote service. In the quote service, what we did, we only created an ID. This ID keeps track of all the quotes that are added, right? So for each quote that is added, it will have this ID assigned to it, right? And then here we created a temporary database. We said this is a temporary database because it's just a list, and then if the program which was to be restarted, this list will be reset, right? That means that it doesn't persist permanently. That's why we said this is a temporary database. And here we created a static instance, which is a singleton, right? And inside the singleton, we decided that in the list that we created above, we want to initialize it with a few quotes, right? So we created two quotes here with ID 0 and ID 1. So therefore this means that the available ID now is 2. So a quote that is added will have an ID of 2. Okay, so after we did that, we also created a method, right? We created a method to get all the quotes in the database, right? And so then we went to the quotes controller. In the quotes controller, we imported the models and the services class because we wanted to use them here, and then we also imported the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC because this is a controller. This is the quotes controller, and we said that this quotes right here forms part of our path to our API, right? And then what we did, we said we wanted to create an HTTP action to get all the quotes from our service to the client. So if in the browser we wanted to get all the quotes, we would call this method right here. We said public action results, which returns a list of quotes. We said get, and then we used the instance or the singleton to call the method in our quote service to get all the quotes in our database, right? If you still don't understand it, it's fine. You'll actually understand it as we go along. So now let's try it out, right? Let's try it out. So we're gonna go here in our terminal. We're gonna say .NET run. Okay, so now that we have our server that is running, right, and it is said that now listening on HTTP localhost 7141 or localhost 5018, doesn't matter which link we click on here, but I'm going to click on this one and open it in the browser. Okay, now for me, I haven't set the certificates yet. So I'm on Linux and it's really a drag to set the certificate. But if this also appears to you, you can go here to advanced and then accept the risk and continue, right? After that, you see now that we are on the browser on this localhost address, right? Remember what I said about the class controller, right? The quote controller, that our path, since we annotated this as an API, this quote controller class is an API controller and the route controller. That means that this part right here, this quote right here, will form part of our link or of our URL. So if I come here and just say /quotes, let me capitalize that and press enter, you see we get our quotes, right? We can also use Swagger. Instead of using the browser itself, we can just say let me copy this link right here, the localhost link, paste it here and just say Swagger. Alright, so as you can see, it's easier now. In Swagger we have following quotes, which is the directory that we created, if you'd remember. This is v1 here. So as you can see here, we have a get method that says get all quotes, right? So if we click here and then press try it out and then press execute, you see that we get all the quotes, right? The first quote has an ID of 0. This is Fallen World Studios. Don't say we didn't do anything for you. And then this is the second quote, 1. Outer unknown world is a vampire. So and you can see here the code is 200. Okay, so this is nice, right? This is good. So why are we able to use Swagger here? You would remember that if we go to our code, we have a template here that was created already, and in this template this service here was added, services.add Swagger generator. So app.environment.isDevelopment app.use Swagger. So we're able to have access to Swagger here due to this code right here. We didn't write this, it was created with template. That's how this template is so nice. Okay, so now that we have a method to get all quotes, right? We have a service URL of quotes, right, that gets all the quotes, which is cool. What if now we wanted to add another method? Let's say now we wanted to add another method to get a single quote. Instead of getting all the quotes, what if you wanted to get a quote by ID, right? So we go back to our service and we add logic for that quote, right? Remember what I said about the quote service? This is the logic of the API service, right? This is where we handle all of our business logic. So we're simply going to go here. All right, we want to create a new method, right? That gets a single quote by ID, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say public static. This time it's just going to be a quote because we want to get a single quote. Sorry, yes, it's going to be public static quote because we're expecting a single quote, and we're going to say get, and this time we're going to pass in int ID, and I'm going to say we must return quotes database dot first or default quote dot ID equals to ID. Okay, let's do this here. Okay, so what is happening here? So what are we doing here? Okay, let me just put this code here like so. Okay, I'm trying to make sense of this. Like, okay, let me just put it back to where it was. Right. Okay, I'm just gonna have to scroll here. Oh, we can just do this. Okay, so what is happening here? Here we're saying we want to get a single quote by ID, right? So we created a method to get a single quote by ID, which returns a quote. So unlike the method above where we get all quotes, which returns a list of quote, here we're just getting a quote, a single quote by ID that is specified, right? So we go into our database and then we iterate over the database, and then we're saying here first or default. This first or default means it returns the first element of the sequence that satisfies a condition, or a default value if no such is found. So what happens here is that this first or default will go through the database, right? It will iterate over the database, always checking this condition for each and every code. So for the first code, it will check whether this first code equals the ID that was supplied here, and if that's the case, then it will return that quote. If not, then it will continue iterating over the list or going through the list until it finds a code that satisfies this condition right here, right? So I hope you understand this. Okay, so let me bring it back here. Okay, so nice. Now that we have logic for getting a single quote by ID in our quote savers, let's go ahead and tell the controller about that. So we're gonna go to the controller now, and we're gonna say http get, but this time we're gonna have to supply an ID, right? So same annotation as get, but this time we're just getting the code by ID, and we're gonna say public action result, right? And we're getting a quote, right? So get int ID, right? And then you're gonna say var quote equals to quote savers dot get, passing in the ID, right? And then you're gonna say if quote is null, return not found, right? Else you return the quote. Okay, so this is simple, right? What is happening here is we're saying quote savers dot get ID. So we're calling this method that we just created right here in the quote savers, this one that gets a single quote, right? And then we're taking that quote and we have to first check if the quote was found, right? So we check if the quote is not null. So if the code is null, we want to return not found. Otherwise, if the code exists, then we return the quote itself, right? And that's it. Now let's try this method out. So we're gonna go to our terminal again and .NET run to run our server. So once the server is running, we can go to our browser, just refresh this. As you can see now, we have a new GET request, right? We have a new API request. So this time with quotes/ID. Here's what's interesting about this. I can just come here and say get and press try it out, enter the ID of 0 and then execute. As you can see here, now I get a code of 200 and I get the response of the ID 0 and the code author and the code itself. So you see I get this single quote right here. So I was able to get a single quote by just passing in the ID. And if you really want to try this out, you can just say here, remember this link, this request URL, you can just copy this URL and just go to the browser and press this quotes and then /0. It'll still give us this single quote, and if we change this to 1, it will give us the quote that matches the ID of 1. So if we press enter here, we now get this quote right here, 1 unknown, the world is a vampire. Awesome, right? So this was cool. This is really cool. So we nearly finished with our API savers, right? So this is cool. Now what we want to do is update an existing quote. So what we want to do is update an existing quote. So we want a method to update an existing quote. For instance, let's get all quotes. Try it out. Execute. So say for instance that right here we have 2 quotes, right? So we have this quote and that quote. So we want to update this quote right here of ID 1, and you want to change this information right here. So we need to write a method for that as well. So remember, we're gonna go to our quote savers and we're gonna add another function. All right. Okay, I'm not really happy with this line being this long, so I'm just gonna come here and do this. Okay. All right. Okay, so we need now to be able to update an existing quote. Right, we need a method to update an existing quote. So we're going to say public static void update. We need update an existing quote. We're going to say quote. All right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to first get the index of this quote. So we're going to say for our index equals to the quote database dot find index of a quote. Let's just say Q, because we already have a quote here in the parameter, so we're just going to say this is quote Q, where Q.id matches the quote that was applied.id. So what is happening here? So here we want to get the index of the quote that was supplied here, right? So what we're doing is we're going to say that in the quotes database we're going to go through each and every quote, right? And if the quote that we are on Q, if this quote that we're currently on, if it's quote number 1, if the quote number 1's ID is the same as the quote ID that was supplied here, then this is the index we're looking for. So this will return the index of that quote. And after we retrieve the index, we're going to check if the index is valid. It's not -1. So if the index is equals to -1, we must return. Right. That means that the quote was not found, right? Otherwise, we'll say quote database index equals to the new quote. All right. So this is how we update it. So we get the index of the code that was given here. No, we get the index of the quote. We're getting the index, get the index of the quote that matches the ID of the quote given. So we get the index of a code in the database that matches the ID of the code that we are given here, right? Okay, and then we check if the code is valid, right? We check if we're actually getting an index. If we're getting an index of -1, it means that the code was not found. Code was not found, then return. Otherwise, update the index. Update the quote by the index. Right. So otherwise, we update the new code at the index with this code that is up to date now. It might seem confusing at first, but trust me, it's so simple. Get the index of the code that matches the ID of the code given. If the code was not found, return. Otherwise, update the existing code with the new code. Right. Okay, so now that we have a method or the logic for updating a single code, let's go to our code controller. So in our code controller, we're gonna say HTTP put this time. We're gonna say HTTP put, and then we're gonna need an ID for this, right? And then we're gonna say public I action this time, I action result, and we're gonna say update int ID quote. Okay, so what's going to happen now is we're going to check if ID matches the new code ID. Right, so we're going to say if ID not equals to quote dot ID, and then we're going to return bad request. Your request is bad, right? We're going to return the bad request error, right? So the bad request produces a status code of 400, right? So that means that the code that was applied is a bad request. Else we're going to check if the quote exists. So you're going to say var existing quote equals quote service dot get, passing in the ID, right? So then we're going to say if existing quote is null, which means it doesn't exist, then we return not found. Right. So if the code and the ID don't match, we return a bad request. If the code is not found in the database, then we return code not found. Otherwise, we just say quote savers dot update the quote, and then we finally return no content. Nice. So no contents just produces an empty status code of 204, right? Okay, so if we return a status code of 204, it means that the code was updated successfully, right? So again, let's go through what we just did. I know it may be a lot, but it's really simple. So remember that we created a getAll method which returns all codes, and then we created a method to get a code by ID, and now we created a method which updates a single code, right? So this is the logic of our code savers. So our codes web API has a logic in the codes savers. This is where all the magic happens. So here we said that we're going to get an index of the code if it matches the ID of the given code, and then we're going to check if the code itself exists, and if it does exist, then we update it using the index, right? So we update the code at this index with the new code, this one, right? So and then we called the code's controller. We passed in the HTTP put attribute with an ID because we're needing to update a single code, so it's unique, it has an ID, and then we pass in the code that we're updating here. So we check if the IDs match. So if this ID that was passed in matches the ID of the code, then we move on to check if the code itself exists in the database. If the code doesn't exist, then return not found. Otherwise, we just update the code and return no content. Alright, now let's try this. So we need to rebuild this, so we need to restart this. So we're just gonna say .NET run alright, and then we go to our browser and we refresh this. Okay, so now we have the put method, right, the update method. So this will update an existing code. So we're gonna go here, we're gonna say try it out, and then we're gonna take the code at ID number 1, and we're gonna update it with 1 as the ID, and then here we're gonna say Solomon born on a Monday. Okay, and then we're going to execute. As you can see here, we get a status of code of 204, right, which means that our code was updated with this information right here. So now if we go to our get all codes, right, and then we execute, try it out, and then execute get all codes, you can see now the code has been updated from, remember before it was, okay, we can even go here to see, before it was unknown, the world is of empire. Now the new code is Solomon, born on a Monday, on ID 1, right? So we're able to update a code. Okay, so now if we refresh even this one, we will see that now it's updated. So remember that this ID is 1, which means this code will be updated. You can see now ID is still 1, but now we have an updated code, Solomon, born on Monday. Okay, so now that we have API request to get all codes, get a single code, and update a code, what about adding a new code, right? What if we wanted to add a new code, right? Let's write a method to add a new code now. So we're just going to close this again. Remember that we always start our quote service, because this is where the magic happens. The logic of our code, of our web API is. The logic of our web API is in the quote service. So what we're going to do now is create a method to add a new quote. Right, add a new quote. So we're going to say public static void add. Right, so we're going to pass in the quote that we're adding, quote, right, and we're gonna say quote dot id. So we're assigning the quote to the available ID. Remember that ID that I told you about, that this ID right here to track each and every code that is added and give it an ID that is available. So we know that there are two codes here that are available. We have 0 and then we have 1. So the next available ID will be 2. Right, so now we assign the new code that is added. We're saying code.id, we're assigning it to the available ID. After that, we need to increment the available ID. We need to increase the available ID so that the next code that is added will get an ID of 3. Right, so this is 2. 2 will be assigned to this new code. So whenever we add another code, it will be 3, and then add another code, it will be 4. Right, and then we just say quote database dot add the code. Nice, so we're done with our business logic. Now let's go to our quotes controller and let it know that we did something. Okay, so we're gonna say now HTTP post, right, since we're adding to the database, and we're gonna say public iAction result, and then we're going to say create, we're going to say iAction result, and we're going to say create quote, right. Okay, so what we're going to do now is say quote service dot add quote, right, quote service dot add quote, and then we're gonna say return create add action. What is this create add action? This creates add action result object produces a status code of 201 created. So this tells us that we successfully created the new code, right? So if we successfully created the new code, then we'll get 201, right? And then this takes in a parameter of, the first part is the action name. We don't even need to know what the action name is. You can just say name of and then just get, right? And then it also takes in the location, right, or the path of the new code that is added. So we're going to say new ID equals quote dot ID, right? And then lastly, we're gonna pass in the code itself. All right, and we're done, right? So we've added a method to add a new code in the code service. So this method adds a new code to the code service, and the code controller here will handle any request from the browser to add a new code. So for instance, here we have iAction result create. So whenever HTTP post is called, this method will be invoked and it will add a new code to the service and then return a status code and the path of the new code that is added. but let's see that in action. So we first need to run the code again, remember that. So .NET run, and then we need to go back to our browser and then refresh. As you can see, now we have a post method, right? Let's say quotes, right? So we're just going to click on this post method right here and then try it out. So here we want to add, the ID doesn't even matter here. Even if we leave the ID field like this, even if we don't enter anything in the ID field and call it 0, remember that in the code right here, in the code service right here, we say that the ID of the code will be assigned to the next available ID. So even if we were to leave that ID here in the browser, you can see the ID is 0. Even if we were to leave it like that, it won't necessarily replace this code right here, because there's already a code with an ID of 0. So that's why we're using the available ID. Okay, so here we'll just update the author. Let's say Memphis. The author is Memphis, and then the quote is, I am the father. I am the father. Okay, so now that we've added information of the author and the quote, the ID doesn't really matter. We don't have to add anything there. And then we execute. So as you can see here, the response is 201, which means that the code was created successfully. And you can see here the ID is 2, the author is Memphis, and quote, I am the father. Right. And remember what I said about the create add action, that it gives us the code 201 and also the location of the new code. So this is the location of the new code. So if we copy this address right here and just press and paste it in the browser like this, we'll get the new code that was just added. But also we can just go to the method for getting all the codes, right? This one, the first one, we're just going to say get all quotes, try it out, execute, and you can see now that we have 0, 1, 2. You can see here, this is Memphis, I am a father. This is the code that was added. Now remember that the available ID now is 3. It's no longer 2, because now this code took the ID of 2. So let's add a new code and see if the next available ID will indeed be 3. So we're going to say post, we're adding a new code. So we're going to reset this. We're going to clear this. And you're going to say the new code now is, let's say, fallen all human in there. We are all human. Okay, so this is the next code, fallen, we are all human, and the ID doesn't really matter. And then we execute. As you can see that the ID now is assigned 3. This is the next available ID, which is 3, and the code is fallen and we are all human. You see, so now when we get all codes again, we can see that a new code was added. Let's just clear this and then execute again. You can see now there's 0, 1, 2, 3. A new code was added and it was assigned the next available ID. So that's it. We've officially, okay, not officially, because we still have one last API request to fulfill, right? So we are able to get all the codes, we're able to add a new code, we're able to get a single code, we're able to update an existing code. Now we want to delete a quote, right? So we want to delete a code by ID. So that is the final method that we need to write. So let's go. So we're going to go back to the code. Remember to close this. And then we go to our code service again. This is a really heavy service now. We've added a lot of code, even though it's just 60 lines. Okay, so yeah, so again, this is the code service, and this is the available ID service. This is the available ID instance, This is the temporary database we're using to store the codes, and so this is only available as long as the program is running. After you restart the program, the data doesn't persist. Okay, so yeah, and then this is a singleton, and then we initialize it with the some small data, and then this is a method to get all codes. This is a method to get a single code by ID. This is a method to update an existing code. This is a method to add a new code. Now we're writing a method to delete the code. So public delete a quote. Delete a quote. Right, delete a quote by ID. Alright, so we're going to say public static void delete. Okay, pass an int ID. Okay, so what do we want now? We want to get the quote that we want to delete. So we're going to say quote equals to, remember that we already have a get method, so we don't need to write that again. We're just going to say get and then pass in the ID of the code that we want to delete, and then we check if the code actually exists. So we're going to say if quote is null. If code doesn't exist, then just return, right? Otherwise you say quote database dot remove the quote. That's easy, right? Simple, right? So what happens here is we get the quote by calling the get method above. This method that gets the code by ID, we already have it, so we don't have to rewrite it again. After we get the code, we check that the code is not null. If it's null, we return. Otherwise, we just remove this quote. Now we just need to tell the controller that we've added a new method in our service. We're just going to say annotation http delete, right? And then we can pass in here the ID, since we're gonna be passing in the ID of the code we want to delete. And then we're gonna say public iaction result delete, passing in int ID, and then we need to say quote dot savers, quote savers dot delete, and then we pass in the ID, right? We pass in the ID, but first we need to check. So we're going to say var quote equals to quote database dot quote savers, so I'll get this quote savers dot get, again same thing we did there, ID. So we're getting this quote and we want to check if the quote is not null. So same thing we did in the quote savers. The same thing we did in the quote savers, we have to do it here as well, so that we return a status code that is valid. So we're going to say quote is null. If the code is null, then you return not found, which means the quote was not found, right? Otherwise you call quote.delete, and then we pass in the ID of the code that we want to delete, and finally we return no content, right? And with this we are officially done with our web API service. So we've created a web API service, which is a quote service. We're able to add a new code, update an existing code, delete a quote, get all the codes, and get a single code, right? So let's go to the browser and test the delete method we just added. So first we need to run the program again in order for this to fetch it. Okay, so we go to the browser, we refresh this. As you can see now, we have the delete API request, right? So we can just come here. Remember, before we delete the code, remember that by getting all the codes, we know that we have only 2 codes now because we're using a list for a database. So every time we restart the program, the list is reset to the original 2 codes that were added here, right? Since we're not using persistent storage. Okay, permanent storage, I mean. So let's say we wanted to delete this first code right here. We know that the ID for this code is 1, so we're going to come here and say quotes and then try it out and then say number 1, right? So we delete the code at ID 1 and then we execute. So we see we get 204. That means this is no content respond. That means that we were successful in deleting the code. Now let us get back to the quotes again. Let's call all the quotes again. Execute. You see now that we only have 1 quote, right? So we've deleted the quote at ID number 1, so now we're only left with 1 quote. This is amazing. And if let's say that we actually try to delete the code again, now remember that code at ID 1 no longer exists because we deleted it. Now let's say we just tried it again, tried deleting it again, and you see that we get a 404, not found. So the code was not found because we already deleted the code. So this is why we have this not found right here on the delete method. We have this not found. So the code was null, therefore we return not found. That's why we get that status code right here. Okay, so we are done. We are done, guys. We are able to get our codes. We're able to add a new code. We're able to get a single code. We're able to update an existing code, and we're able to delete a code. Nice. Okay, now for a challenge, let's say we wanted, okay, this will be your challenge, right? So right now we're only able to delete 1 code, right, by ID. What if you wanted to delete all the codes? Instead of just deleting a code by ID, what if you just wanted to delete all the codes in the database? So I challenge you to actually add an API request to delete all the codes in the database, to clear the database, right? Instead of just deleting a single code by ID, right? So we are officially done with the video. It was a long one, so I hope you understood. If you didn't understand, I will link I'll provide a link in the description to the documentation, the official Microsoft documentation, so you can look at the information yourself as well. But yeah, it's officially done. So the main thing we did here is we added firstly the models folder, and then in it we created a model for a code because we're creating a code service. So if you're creating a weather service, you would add a model for the weather forecast, right? Or for example, if you were creating a service for a hotel, right, you will add a room model or whatever it is that you're working with, right? It's really up to you here. So you can add as many models and as many controllers as well. It's really up to you, whatever you're working with, because you can have more than one controller here depending on the service that you're creating or the services that you're creating, because you can have multiple services as well. So what we did here is we added a models folder and created a single model, and then we created a services folder and created a single service which corresponds to the model we created here. And the service is the logic that handles all the requests from the controller, right? So whenever the controller receives a request, it calls the service. So the service then processes the request from the controller, right? So for example, if the codes controller wanted to get all the codes, right? So the codes controller will get browser request, right, or a client request, and then the controller will then call the code service, right? It will say, hey, code service, I received this type of request, do we have a method for this type of request? And then obviously the code service will have that method or that logic, and then it will process that logic and returns it back to the controller, right? So it's basically three things here that are working in tandem. We have the model, then we have the service, and then we have the code controller, and all this will give us the web API, the model view controller architecture of web API. Okay, so I hope you learned something on the video. Please leave a comment. I can't help with the keyboard noise, so if you're complaining about the keyboard noise, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about that. But yeah, please like and subscribe, and yeah, thank you.